See if anybody else is on.
At the very end.
Are you ready, Carrie?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. I see some new faces, so welcome to Conesville. We're excited tonight to be hosting John Duda for our second time. John tonight is speaking about New York State Railroad history. But before we begin, I just want to invite you to a few other things coming that are upcoming. First of all, we have refreshments over there if at any point you want to get a snack or to drink. Afterwards, we'll take a 5 to 10 minute break, and then we'll have a quick meeting for anybody that would like to stay. In April, we have our annual meeting on April 21st. It's a Sunday. If you're interested in that, information is in the email. And our guest speaker this year is forest historian Michael Kudich. Will be speaking on bogs and what they can reveal to us about history. And he's coming to us with some recent research regarding the Bull Hill Bog, which is near the end of Bull Hill Road, and some fascinating information about that. And we'll have a dinner catered by the Horseshoe Cafe. It is $30 for the entire event, which will include some kind of reflections and looking ahead. Also in April, on the 22nd, it's Earth Day. So we will be meeting at the town park around 6:30 to do some cleanup. We have some things donated from the CWC last year for their stream cleanup, so we'll be using that. And then on that Friday is National Historic Marker Day on the 26th, I think it is. On that day, we'll also be meeting here around 6:30, and then we'll be dispersing to clean our historic markers. So we'll have 4 groups if there's enough people, and each group will be tasked with cleaning one. And then in May, on the second Tuesday, we have a team from Prattsville coming. Carolyn Bennett, who is the Prattsville historian and the director of the Pratt Museum, is bringing with her Mike, and I'm not sure of Mike's last name at this moment, but Mike and Carolyn will be speaking to us about the landscape of Pratt Rock in the area and some of the history behind it. So that's the Conesville Historical Society in the next few months. We're super excited about that, and I'd like to thank John once again for coming, and you can begin. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me again. Before I start, is sort of dovetailing what Kim was just saying. If you're at all interested in the railroad history, you need this book. This is Mike Kudich's book on the railroads in the Catskills. Mike's profession was university professor of forestry, which he did for about 30 years, I think. But his hobby was the railroads. He wrote a 3-volume set on railroads in the Adirondacks, and then a number of years later wrote this on the railroads in the Catskills. And I encourage all of you to come to the luncheon next month, because he's a phenomenal speaker, because he knows his stuff so well. When he researched this book, he literally walked like every inch of the old railroads, so he could draw a map saying that the remnants of a water tank were here, and there's a collapsed culvert here. He literally went every mile, and he shares that knowledge. So I can't say enough good things about Mike, and I encourage all of you to come here, and it'll be a different topic, but he knows his bogs and forestry better than anyone. So anyway, that plug aside. So, welcome to today's class, New York State Railroad History 101. There will be a PowerPoint presentation with 327 slides and a quiz afterwards. Okay, just joking. There's less than 50 images, no quiz, just happy to do a Q&A afterwards. And on the table over here, I have quite a few New York State Railroad history books, a number of the cards that I use for images in the PowerPoint if you want to look closer, and a number of other cards that aren't in the PowerPoint. So hopefully if you're interested, you come up and talk later, and you'll probably have to shut me down because I can talk railroads with people all night. So you're going to want to get out of here for your meeting or get your meeting done before it gets too late. So tell me when to stop. We're going to start by looking at my favorite railroad, the Delaware and Eastern. Later it was known as the Delaware Northern. It existed from 1905 until 1942. It almost became your local railroad, so it might have been a favorite of yours if things had played out differently, but that didn't happen. But hopefully you'll see a lot of the interest there. Work began on it in 1905. This is an image of driving the first spike, September 14th, 1905. This would have been, it was originally, there was a grand vision of connecting the coal fields in Pennsylvania to the Albany, Schenectady area, and then even New England. The idea being that the route they were proposing would have been more direct and hence cheaper than the way coal was traveling at that point, which was largely on the D&H or the O&W, which sort of, they went around the Catskills mostly, whereas this route would come right through the center and hence could be cheaper. But what they decided to do was first build the nucleus of it, which was about 38 miles from Arkville to East Branch, through the valley of what was then the East Branch of the Delaware River. Now partly under the Pepacton Reservoir, but below and above the reservoir are still remnants of the East Branch. It actually starts between Grand Gorge and Roxbury and makes its way down. So that first part they began building in 1905, and they managed to build about 37 and a half miles. It's funny, and Mike Kudish talks about this at some length. There's actually a discrepancy on the mileage, believe it or not, that their own timetables showed different mileages, so it's a little fuzzy, but it was around 37 and a half. And then there was an 8.5 mile spur that was built shortly later from partway down around Union Grove up to Andes. It was plagued by troubles from the onset. This image is from one of their most notorious wrecks in May of 1908. The engine fell over into the river. The engineer was alive, but he was pinned under the overturned engine. Only a little teeny bit of his head was above water, and other personnel on the train took turns helping him hold his head above water. It took about 5 hours for them to get the heavy equipment in that was necessary to, pull the engine off of him and get him out. Fortunately, he did survive. This was a newspaper article in the Catskill Mountain News about that. So he was under the engine 5 hours, narrow escape from death. Unfortunately, as anyone who's done any railroad reading knows, railroads weren't terribly safe, so this is not unusual. So many people lost their lives, lost limbs, had injuries. It was not safe to work on a railroad, or a lot of times to even be a passenger on a railroad, but that improved somewhat as time went by. There were 2 trestles on the branch that went up to Andes, and it's a little confusing. One of them was Muir, M-U-I-R, and the other was Moore, M-O-O-R-E, but there were 2 different trestles. And one of the great stories there is that the other trestle, not the one I'm showing here, this is Muir, but the Moore trestle was used in the filming of a 1920 movie. It was supposed to be in Alaska, but obviously it was easier to film in upstate New York than to travel to Alaska at that point to film. And as part of the filming, the film people sort of touched up the trestle a little bit, put some fresh paint on it, and just did a little minor cosmetic work. Well, that had an unintended consequence because the next time the New York State Railroad inspector came, he commented, "Oh, you finally listened to me and fixed the trestle," because he had been complaining that the trestle had been in deteriorating condition. So the little touch-up that the movie company gave fooled New York State Railroad inspector. So this is an article again from the Catskill Mountain News from 1942 about the closing of the Delaware Northern. They had hoped to hold on with the prospect of the building the Pacton Reservoir, but that got delayed by World War II, and they just couldn't hold on any longer. They weren't making money. They were already saving money every way they could. Most famous thing was, most of the time they didn't run an engine with cars behind it. They ran what was called a brill car, which is a gasoline-powered one car that had, the engineer, the conductor. It actually, part of it was used for sorting of mail, to carry passengers, to carry freight, all in this one car powered by gasoline, which was a heck of a lot cheaper to run than a full train with an engine and multiple cars after that. So they tried things like that, but they just couldn't hold on any longer. So they ended up, the last train was October 17, 1942. And I'm going to digress here. Sometimes in today's world, you sort of like have an interface with history, and it sort of makes you stop and think or smile. I gave a talk on the Delaware and Eastern a number of years ago for Diane Galusha's group in Margaretville. So I'm at the very end of it, I get to this, on October 17, 1942, the last train ran. And a voice piped up in the audience. I was on that train. I don't know if any of you know Len Utter. He was on that train. And to be giving history talk and hear from somebody who was on that was pretty awesome. Now we're going to change lanes. Just to think for a millionaire, your own private incline railroad. I'm afraid the images aren't that great. I only have two of this. I didn't even know about this for years, and then I found these two postcards. Did a little research on it. It's called the Harriman Incline. It's down in Orange County, and it was built in 1904 by railroad magnate Edward Harriman to help in the construction of his mansion that he was building on the top of the mountain, Arden House. And it was actually continued to serve the mansion well into the 20s, transporting visitors and supplies up the mountain to the estate. There's actually a young man down in that area who's done a lot of research on this lately, and he gives programs. I want to try to catch one of his programs because he obviously knows a lot more than I do, but I just wanted to share the couple of images of it to give you some sense of this is a private incline railroad that, hey, sure, you got the money, you can build it. And you can bring people up to your mansion on your private railroad. I call this section, They Stole Our Railroad Station, which is just one part of a very long history, but it's one of the more unusual. So I like, when I worked on a talk for unusual railroad history, that was the bit that had to go in. So the Ulster-Delaware Railroad ran from Rondout on the Hudson up to Oneonta, eventually. Those of you who know your local railroad history know that it sort of stalled in Stamford for about 10 years. And then when they resumed building, it got built in a different direction from what was originally planned. But it was originally chartered in, I think, 1866, and they had grand plans. Usually railroads come up with grand-sounding schemes to try to help with the sale of bonds. So their announced plan was to run from Kingston all the way up to Oswego on Lake Ontario. That was never going to happen. Fairly quickly, they started building. They got as far as Stamford in, I think, 1872. By that point, it's not even the Rondout and Oswego anymore. It's become the Kingston and Syracuse. So they've scaled back a little. They're still hoping to make it up to Syracuse. The construction is stalled in Stamford for, I want to say, about 10 years. It gets reorganized again as the Ulster and Delaware under Thomas Cornell, who had shipping interests on the Hudson, but saw the handwriting on the wall that railroads were the thing of the future. So he got into the railroads in a big way. He was on the boards of quite a few of the railroads. And so he was the driving force behind the Ulster and Delaware, and then after he passed, his son-in-law, Samuel Kuykendall, ran the railroad for many years. The thing I focus on here is about a little incident where the Alabama Depot was removed, and this is an article, again, from the Catskill Mountain, quoting from the Pine Hill Sentinel, but printed in the Catskill Mountain News. Basically what happened was that there were two depots near Shandaken. One was called Shandaken, and the other was called, the Alvin Fox Hollow and the Shandaken. So they ended up deciding that the one station had to go. There was flooding, it was not in good shape. So they basically closed it and combined the two stations into one. And there was a lot of local outcry against that, because of course all the people near the closed station were not happy. But of course, it ended up being a fait accompli. But it was done the kind of thing where they did it in the middle of a Sunday night so that there couldn't be a judge with a court injunction, things like that. Again, you'll find a good account of it in Mike Kudish's book. Besides his incredible maps, I mean, he's done all these hand-drawn maps, but there's also a lot of text with great history. So I can't say enough good things about him in the book. This is just another unusual, this is a pretty rare card. I've never seen it reproduced anywhere else. It's the parlor car on the Catskill Mountain Limited Ulster and Delaware Railroad. And you see some of the staff lounging in the parlor car. But just to have an interior shot on the train is really, really rare. You see tons of them, barreling down the tracks, but an interior shot is kind of neat. Now we're going to talk about a little railroad that thought it could. The Middleburg and Schoharie was one of the shortest lines in New York State. It was begun in 1867, shortly after the line connecting Albany and Binghamton was completed. We're going to talk more about that later. In that era, railroad financing was pretty wild and woolly. Many proposed lines never got built. Some got built but were so much in debt that they were quickly taken over by other outfits. So this line ran in cooperation with the Schoharie Valley Railroad, which ran from Schoharie up to Schoharie Junction, which was on that Albany and Susquehanna line. And what this line did was added the extra mileage from Schoharie down to Middleburg, so that Middleburg could have its own railroad. So the Middleburg and Schoharie was just a very short 5.8 miles, but it was a separate railroad company with its own stock, its own board, all those things. In practice, the Middleburg and Schoharie and the next line up from Schoharie operated together. They shared equipment and personnel, but on paper they were separate entities, this one being literally 5.8 miles. The line, okay, so this would be the railroad station in Middleburg, which has just recently been reworked, and is it open regularly or occasionally?
I think on occasion. I don't think it's regularly open.
But some history there has been preserved, and in some way it can be visited again. So just an unusual line. This line closed in 1936, a victim, as so many others were, of America's growing love affair with cars and trucks. As more and more people were traveling by car and more freight was traveling by truck, especially the smaller railroads had a really hard time of it. The Schoharie Valley lasted a few years longer. I think that went under in 1942. So now I'm going to talk about a huge attraction in its day, and perhaps it may one day be again. And some people have argued with me on this, but you'll hear I think I have an answer, or a possible answer to them. The Mount Beacon Incline Railway was built in, construction started in 1900, and it opened Memorial Day weekend of 1902. It was built by the Otis Elevator Company, the same folks who had created the Otis Incline Railway up to the Catskill Mountain House in the 1890s. And we're going to talk more about that one later. For much of the 20th century, the Mount Beacon Railway was a huge tourist attraction. Folks would flock up the Hudson from New York City and downstate, either by the day line or by train, take a trolley to the foot of Mount Beacon, and then take the incline railway up to the top. A number of amenities were built at the top. There was a hotel. There was what they call the casino, not our definition of a casino, but like an amusement hall kind of thing. And there were also apparently private cottages. If you had the big bucks and wanted your own place up there, you could do that. And just a little bit, I'm not super technical, but basically the way an incline railroad works, both this one and the Otis, there is no motive power in the car. There's a stationary engine up at the top that runs a cable, and there are two cars. So if you picture there's one car at the bottom ready to come up and one car at the top ready to come down. And there's basically one track, and then at the exact middle, it opens up into two tracks. So and they're timed obviously, they're going simultaneously. The car leaves the bottom, starts going up. The car leaves the top, starts going down. They get to the middle, where there are two tracks, they pass each other, and continue on their way. But this could all be done, by a cable powered from above, rather than having, any kind of engine on the car to power it. So it was a different way of doing it, but that was kind of necessary due to the steep incline, because a regular railroad engine has a real problem with anything over 2% grade is difficult. 3.5, I think, is getting where it can't be done. So for a steep incline like this or the Otis, you need this different way of powering. So here's another view. This is at the foot of the incline. That would be with Newburgh in the distance, and Beacon a little closer. The line ceased operation in 1978, and a fire destroyed it in 1983. Bear with me. So it was destroyed in 1983. For a number of years now, there have been efforts afoot to rebuild it, restore it, and make it a tourist attraction. There are some details about that online, and I've had people come literally yelling at me, that's not going to happen, can't be done, nobody would ever do that. Well, as a matter of fact, folks in Colorado did that. Anybody who's been out and seen the Colorado, the Georgetown Loop was an incredible railroad that was built for mining in the 1880s. And it, like all other railroads, declined in the 20th century and it was dismantled in 1938. Yet decades later, people decided that they could rebuild it as a tourist operation. And in 1984, they completed reconstruction and opened for passengers, and they're still running. So those folks who say it can't be done at Mount Beacon, I say, look what they did in Colorado. So just letting you know it can't happen. Yeah, so do you need a 6-mile railroad to get to your hotel? Why not build it yourself? Again, railroading in the 19th century was so wild and woolly in the early 20th. You literally, you had these individuals who would just build their own railroad, either because they were rich and, wanted the show thing, or in this case, a guy who needed a better way to get people to his hotel. So, until he opened his own railway in August 1906, travel to Paul Smith's Hotel on Lower St. Regis Lake was a convoluted affair. 3 different train lines were relatively nearby, from 4 to 8 miles away. But this meant carriages had to be sent to each, multiple times each day to meet the numerous trains. Smith soon realized he needed his own rail link. And having already created his own powerhouse, he knew it should eventually be electric, i.e. a trolley rather than a steam train. Initially, though, he had to make do with steam. A steam engine was used as the track was laid in 1906, and for the initial runs after the connection opened. Besides bringing his hotel guests, he would also bring the private railroad cars of the very well-to-do who were heading up to their cottages in the Adirondacks. And they could park them there and then go across the lake to their palatial cottages. I guess they also called them camps, but it made them sound rustic, but anybody who's been to any of them or seen the pictures, some of these were incredibly opulent. So it took nearly 3 years for Smith to get the trolley running as he wanted it to, but then it functioned fine until the end of the hotel, and the main building burned in September of 1930. So this is one shot of it, and another, this is Paul Smith's Railway at Paul Smith's. So again, sure, build your own railroad. There's a lot more about the Adirondacks railroads Mike Hoosh did the 3 volumes on the railroads up there, so you'll find a lot more history there. Now we're going to talk about Charles Beach's brainstorm. He actually had 2 of them, Catskill Mountain Railway and the Otis Railroad. So, by rail to the Catskill Mountain House. The Catskill Mountain House opened in the early 1820s. By the 1880s, it was world-renowned. Presidents came, celebrities came, the rich came. The only drawback was getting there. Until the 1880s, you basically took the Hudson River boat to Catskill, then endured a long and very rough horse-drawn coach ride, with the worst part of a climb for which you might actually have to get out of the coach and climb up yourself. The road was that steep and rough, and depending on how many passengers and how much luggage and all, people actually would have to get out and walk. So Charles Beach wanted to, who at that point was the owner of the Mountain House, he'd been involved with it for years, then took it over, and then he and his family ran it for years. So he wanted to fix this. So the first step was creating the Catskill Mountain Railway, which ran along an old right-of-way from a railroad that had failed years ago, bringing customers in the comfort of a train, to the foot of the mountain. So you at least were spared the jarring ride all the way from Catskill Point to the foot of the mountain. So this would be just before Palindale, directly below the Mountain House. But then you still had the rough ride or walk up. The solution, so here's the railroad, oh, I'm sorry, I digress. Part of that line also branched off to Cairo, so this is just an image of the Cairo station. And the much smaller station at Cairo Junction. This is where the line split, with the one part of it going to Palinville, where you get off at the foot of the mountain, and the other branch going to Cairo. So Beach's next brainstorm was the Otis. So he engaged the Otis elevator people to construct an incline railroad. So this is 10 years before the Mount Beacon Railroad. So it was a newer thing, and I'm not even sure. I think there were other inclines in the country, but this was certainly a new thing for this area. And but the Otis people had it figured out, and the mechanics are the same as I said for the Mount Beacon, that there'd be the powerhouse at the top running the cable, the cars would pass in the middle. So this would be the Otis Summit Railroad Station and the power plant. And so the train you see was actually Beach's railroad he constructed to lead from the top of the Otis into Haynes Falls and Tannersville. And remember I said sometimes the railroads there were so many of them that they were competing in very strange ways. This was a case where you had two railroads literally, a stone's throw from each other, covering the same territory. Because in the meantime, in the 1880s, the Ulster-Delaware Railroad had built from Phoenicia a line up through Stony Clove that got to Hunter, and then Haynes Falls to Tannersville and Haynes Falls. And then from Haynes Falls, they had a train that went all the way to Catterskill Lake. They were closer, the Ulster-Delaware people were closer to the folks at the new Catterskill Hotel, a man named Harding. And so their final station was there at the lake, closer to Harding's establishment. Beach, with typical daring do, said, "I'll fix you, I'll build my own railroad." So he built the railroad literally from the Mountain House into, not just to South Lake to connect with the Ulster-Delaware, but to parallel the Ulster-Delaware all the way to Tannersville. So you literally had two lines right next to each other. If you walk today the Ulster-Delaware Railroad Trail from the Haynes Falls station out to Catterskill Falls, you look off to the side and you can see the grade for the other railroad. So this is another view, just showing the trackage down the Otis Incline. And so this is what I was saying, that there were a whole bunch of railroads on the mountaintop. So you can see the Otis showing you, this is the topo map from around 1900. So you've got the Otis and the railroads leading all the way to Haynes Falls. Just to show you that there were, again, this mishmash. And there's a famous photo where you see the two depots together, literally like one right next to the other. But they were separate companies and competing companies. Sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't. So this would be the Haynes Falls, the early station in Haynes Falls. And this would be the newer station in Haynes Falls, which is today the home of the Mountaintop Historical Society. They did a wonderful job with this property. They spent many years restoring it, and actually in recent years have just been working on it some more to upgrade and necessary repairs. But it's an incredible structure, and this is one of the finest surviving stations from the railroad era. This would have been built right at the peak of the railroads. The Ulster-Delaware Railroad's peak year was 1913. In that year, they carried 676,000 passengers just on their railroad into the Catskills. And the station was built right then. So this is when they're at the peak. And of course, no one knew that World War II was coming, or that trucks would end up taking most of the freight and cars would take most of the people. So this was built in optimism. Unfortunately, it's still with us today. You go inside it, and they've done a wonderful job of going. You can really get a sense of how fine, some of the old railroad stations were. Oh, here's that shot I was telling you, where you see the two stations, like one right above the other. And just a few tickets from Haynes Falls. You could go anywhere, because obviously you would connect either in Catskill or in Kingston, depending which railroad you're on, and you can go anywhere. And I want to talk briefly about some lines that were never meant for passengers. There were logging, industrial use, and construction, were the cause for a number of railroads in New York State. When New York City settled on the site for the Ashokan Reservoir, there was a lot of work involved. And as part of the construction effort, the contractor, MacArthur Brothers, had to build several miles of their own rail to facilitate moving supplies, stone, and equipment. The tracks went all the way to a quarry, which you can now hike to just above the Olive Bridge side of the dam. There's a new park here. It's a relatively new trail. If you haven't been on it, it's really cool because you can see where they actually quarried the stone from. You can see remnants of some of the structures that they built, for the railroad. But the hike to the top, offers some great views too. They actually had to rebuild. They built this just for the construction, but as the reservoir filled, they had to relocate part of the tracks. So something that was built for the construction had to be moved during the construction. So there were actually two separate bits. Mike has a whole chapter on the construction of the Ashokan and the railroads that were built for it. They built this huge trestle. If you can imagine this, the original Ulster, Delaware was going up the Esopus Valley. So it would have been at 90 degrees to this structure that you see now, at the bottom of the valley along the Esopus. What the people who were constructing the dam needed was something that they could get supplies back and forth across the valley. So they built this huge trestle just for their construction purposes. This is another view of that. I like to include this card because I tell a story on myself here. I had the previous card you saw in my collection, that was good. I saw this card in an antique shop in Madison, Bouteville. And I fussed and said, I'm not paying $20 for that card. And I left. The thing haunted me all week. I went back the following Saturday. Fortunately, it was still there, so I got the card. But just when you see a card or another item that you've never seen, if you collect something, chances are you're better off getting it the first time rather than having to go back for it. So that's a story on myself. So not all railroads were built for passengers. There were a number of logging railroads in the Catskills. John Hamm, who's done a lot of work on the railroads in the Catskills also, I don't know who's familiar with his, he's got a lot of great picture books, great images of the railroading up here. There's one elusive line on the mountaintop. That was actually near North-South Lake. I've seen what are supposed to be like just remnants of a ramp, but I haven't found much, but supposedly there are remnants in there. But a lot of research has been done on the Fenwick Lumber Company Railroad, which operated briefly outside of Lanesville. Surveyor Rick Brooks has done programs on it, and I was fortunate to be on a hike organized by Mountaintop Historical to explore the site. Rick led it, and Mike Kudish was on the hike. It was really interesting. I learned so much on that hike. My feet hurt at the end, but it was some serious scrambling up some very steep slopes. Essentially a logging company from West Virginia. Some have decided that they wanted to get at some of the old growth that was still in the Catskills. Obviously any big trees that were relatively accessible to roads had been logged over the previous century. But there were still pockets, and even today there are a few, where the original old growth, the big tall trees, still existed because they were so hard to get to. Well, this company decided that what they were going to do was build an incline railroad, not for passengers, but just to get the lumber down. That the hill was so steep that there was no way that they could get it down either with horse and wagon or anything else like that. So their solution was this incline railroad. And they actually built two legs. There was one going up from the Lanesville side to the top of, I think it's South Hunter Mountain. It's not the main part of Hunter Mountain where the fire tower is, but the mountain behind it. And then another extension going down the other side to the Spruceton Valley that you get to from Westkill. I believe this image is of that side. They only operated for a few years, of course. They're pretty intensive. They're in there, they cut the big trees, they get them out on their railroad. And they actually had a siding on the Ulster, Delaware in Edgewood, just above Lanesville, so that they would get the lumber down to their sawmill, which is at the foot of the incline railroad, process it there, and then get it out onto the Ulster, Delaware for shipment. One of their main contracts was with the people who were building the Ashokan Reservoir, so that a lot of the lumber went to the construction of the reservoir. This would be another image. Again, I'm not super technical, but if you see these gizmos sort of right in the middle, from what I understand, these were so that the cables wouldn't fly up in the air. It was such a steep incline that in order to manage running the car without the cable going haywire 30 feet in the air or whatever, they would have to hold it down with these. But again, I'm not good with the technical stuff, so. Now we're going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about the one that the robber baron lost. One of our area's most famous residents was Jay Gould, who started out innocently enough map making and surveying, and he wrote a history of Delaware County, but in fairly short order he was in New York City and quite quickly became one of the wealthiest men and certainly one of the most feared and definitely one of the most hated of all the financiers of that era. And he could be pretty rough. So this is just one item from the Schenectady Reflector, a newspaper in 1869. Basically what was going on is that Gould and his people, who already pretty much controlled the Erie Railroad, wanted to take over the Albany and Susquehanna, the new line that had been built from Albany to Binghamton. And it's an incredible legal saga. I've read many pages about it. Some of it's a little fuzzy, but it basically boiled down to, who bought the best judge or who bought the most judges. So you had Gould and his people claiming, that through stock manipulation, that they were, the rightful people to direct the Albany and Susquehanna. And then you had the Albany and Susquehanna people trying to fight back. And they were just that small line from Albany to Binghamton, so certainly not as big as Gould and his Erie and all his other interests. But they did a smart thing. They ended up working with the Delaware and Hudson folks. And the Delaware and Hudson people ended up taking them over. But what they did succeed in doing was preventing Gould and his people from taking it over. But this is hard to imagine. The governor of New York State declared the area in a state of insurrection because there were literally battles going on up and down the railroad between Albany and Binghamton. The Erie people would come up in a train from Binghamton, literally take over a station, and okay, we're in charge now. And the Delaware or the Albany Susquehanna people would be coming down from Albany in the other direction with their trainloads of thugs, and they both had trainloads of thugs wielding clubs, taking over stations back and forth. So the governor ends up declaring it in a state of insurrection. Things quiet down. It goes finally into the courts, and it was one of the rare ones that Jay Gould lost. So, and kind of, he didn't always win. Now, very briefly, I want to talk about the modern journey from rails to trails. As we've talked about, railroading sort of declined over most of the 20th century. A lot of the tracks were just torn up, used for scrap. There are a few remnants, though, and some still have track, and a few still have trains. We're hoping that the railroad in Arkville can get going again. They've been working on tracks for several years. In Phoenicia, there's a new experience. You can take basically, it's a bike on the rails that has replaced, the previous tourist railroad, but a modern way or a new way of utilizing the rail. But one of the most pervasive is when the tracks have been taken up, because you have, this lengthy right-of-way covering, large distances, some of them pretty scenic. The idea of converting it to trails is, taking root. One of the early examples was the bridge at Poughkeepsie. For 100 years or so, this functioned, as the bridge that brought rail traffic over the Hudson at Poughkeepsie. Then in the 1970s, I think, was a fire that pretty much devastated the bridge. It wasn't worth fixing up. There wasn't enough traffic. It would cost too much. And conversely, it would cost too much to take it down. So they sort of just left it there rotting. And then initially one guy and then a number of other people came on board, and before too long, there was a whole crew of people working on the idea of converting this to a walkway. So today, what had been this great railroad bridge, and the structure is still there, has been converted into the walkway over the Hudson, which is one of New York State's most visited parks. Anybody who hasn't done it, it's a really neat walk. You get a real sense of the river and the railroad history. And it's nice to see, in some way, it's been preserved. Obviously, the tracks are gone, but you're still walking across that, railroad bridge from the 19th century. Another example that I like to give is the railroad trestle in Rosendale. When this was built as part of the small spur that ended up at Kingston, a lot of folks were too scared to ride the train over it. Literally, the initial couple of runs over it, people got off just beforehand and wanted to watch to make sure that the train would get across. It did, and it was fine. But fortunately, this structure, has also been preserved, and today is a walkway on the rail trail there at Rosendale. So that's another one I would urge folks to check out. So, a number of rails historians have enriched my knowledge of New York State railroads. I want to particularly thank John LeBar, Michael Kudish, and John Ham. All have been terrific in providing information, answering questions, and giving me some sense of just how rich New York State rail history is. The collection of books by Mr. Ham provides so many wonderful images, and the maps and detailed research by Dr. Kudish are an absolute necessity for anyone trying to understand where the railroads ran and how they operated. I want to dedicate this program to 3 Catskills historians who are no longer with us. I learned so much from them and wish there had been time to learn more. I honor the memory of Justine Hummel, Lonnie Gale, and Tim Mallory. I've got a number of books here folks can look at, quite a few of the cards that were in the PowerPoint, and some that weren't. And as I said, I'm happy to talk railroads until Kim tells me to shut up.
Sorry. Something interesting that you mentioned about 1866, and I remember doing research in Westchester, and 1866 is when the eminent domain law came into effect. And in the archives of the land records, I could see all these landowners selling their land to what was the Connecticut Railroad Company along the Sawmill River, which would later become Metro North. I wondered if you've ever seen anything like that. Have you been to the archives to see people selling their land to the railroads?
I've never done work on that. I know those deeds exist, and just for example, how it gets tweaked in the 20th century, the Ulster and Delaware Railroad ceased operation altogether in 1976. By then it was a branch of New York Central. It was no longer separate. But 1976 was the last freight train. The last passenger train was 1954. So that track just literally sat and rotted. A few years later, you start to get some interest in a tourist railroad, things like that. But the two counties approached it differently. The rights of way in Ulster County were somehow handled differently from the way Delaware County handled the rights of way. So that it was a very different process for the folks who had the rail ride in Phoenicia, and now the folks who have the rail bikes. And then another leg of that is down in Kingston. The original Catskill Mountain Railway still has a tourist run in Kingston. The folks in Delaware County had a very different way of going about it and how they handled the right-of-way, the ownership. They created a corporation, basically, to oversee this, which Ulster County did. Ulster County just basically had the rights-of-way and would lease it to whomever. But that's convoluted history, and I've actually seen their old valuation maps where they just show the length of the railroad, and this is a right of way from farmer so and so, and this is a right of way from the miller, and this is a right of way. That alone is like a lifetime of research.
Yeah.
So again,
Are you aware of the only railroad bridge that never saw a train cross it?
I don't think so.
The old Cherry Valley Railroad, which got taken over by the Delaware and Hudson, coming from Warnerville up through Seward, Sharon Springs, and around.
In another version of this talk, I include that. I've done a similar talk in Sharon Springs, and I included it there.
Yeah, when they widened and straightened out near US 20, they built a new bridge for the railroad to go over, and by the time everything got finished, the D&H had abandoned the rail.
Wow.
Oh, so
the bridge is still there,
but it never had a train on it. No, I didn't know that part. I knew that was the old railroad. I thought it was the old railroad bridge.
Yeah.
But you're telling me it's a new railroad bridge that never had a train.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Because it was ground level originally till they did the cuts for US 20.
Just a quick question regarding that one cog railroad that they put in to get the timber out. How long would this take them to build that? If they were cutting timber?
The whole operation lasted roughly 7 years. There's actually a new book that a lady who got some information from Rick Brooks just came out with a book on the Fenwick. She would have the exact dates and time. But they built the railroad fairly quickly. I mean, it was a bare bones operation. Because it was not built for passengers, it was just literally so that they could get with the power plant at the top, running the cable to, gently lower the car down with the lumber. Again, I want to say roughly 1907 to 1913, somewhere in there, but fairly quickly they had it built and operational. And today, when you hike anywhere around there, you can find some of the, where there'd be a level path where they were using horses to bring the timber to, you know, the steep. The horse could manage on the level ground with the lumber, but you could not use it to, you know, to try to cart it down.
I was gonna ask, I don't know if you're aware of the railroad line that runs through Cooperstown Junction over by Goodyear Lake in, Delaware County?
That's a good one.
Is that Otsego, yes. Would that have been part of the Albany to Binghamton loop? I mean, like, what railroad would that fit into? Because I don't think they use it anymore.
Again, back then, there were so many smaller, separate lines.
Yeah.
And one of the things that ends up happening is that over time they get consolidated, so that, you know, at this point, we have our only passenger railroad, basically all Amtrak and the commuter lines, like, you know, Metro North,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But nationally, but back then, there literally, as I was saying earlier, you know, there would be 5-mile lines. So that would have been one of those short, independent lines that connected to one of the bigger lines. But the thing to remember is before we got our automobiles and our trucks, the only way your community could connect with the outside world, unless you were riding a horse or pulling a wagon with a horse, was by rail. So every town really wanted a rail connection. And this is how they financed the railroads. And unfortunately, there was a lot of times some really shady doings with that financing. And the perfect example is fairly local. When the railroad when the Ulster Delaware got to Stamford in 1872, their original plans were to continue basically up Route 23 through Harpersfield. But for whatever reason, construction stopped for about 10 years. And during that period, they rethought it and decided that the slopes going down the west branch to Bloomville and then over to Meredith would have been less steep than the slope up to Harpersville, so that they decided to reroute it. Unfortunately, Harpersfield and I think several other towns along the original proposed route had invested heavily in the railroad, so that, and they were in the courts over this for many, many years. There was a similar thing. There was a railroad proposed to connect Margaretville, Andes, and Delhi. It never got built, but people invested money, and some of the towns who invested money were paying, paying this investment for many years.
Yeah, so, and maybe I got here late, so you probably, I don't want you to repeat yourself if I missed it, but we probably think that the whole economic boom here in the Catskills was attributed to the railroads. And did the railroads invest in the creameries and the feed stores? I know a lot of old farmers that feel, for example, before Sheffield Creamery, there was Slauson and Decker Creamery. Decker sounds an awful lot like a railroad name. Do you happen to know anything on that?
That's kind of a complicated question, because there are times when you know that the railroad built a station in a particular place because the creamery was there. The railroad also did, have some of the facilities for milk. For example, the ice houses. They needed ice to keep the milk cool on the trip down to the city. So the railroad had ice houses on, Mayhem's?
Yes.
Mayhem's Pond? Yeah. Down, and then on Lake Wawaka in Hawkettville, and by me on Lake Switzerland, they harvested ice. And that was, the railroad actively took a part in that. How much they actually owned in terms of creameries, that I'm not sure on. They encouraged them, because this was but it's not that they owned them, it's that they were counting on them for revenue. So they would try to work with them, but it's not so much that they owned them, but that they were working with them because they wanted that freight revenue.
Sure. Thank you.
down to this building just reminded me that the railroad played an important part in the early history of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Conesville, Gilboa, Blenheim, and West Fulton are part of the New York Annual Conference, which is based down to New York City, because that's where the railroads went. And the rest of Schoharie County was in what at that time was the Troy Conference, because access to the railroads took you to Troy, not Albany. And that split is still today. Troy is now part of the Upper New York Conference. Yeah.
I invite folks to come up and look here. I do want to point this book out, though. This was recently reissued about the railroading in Schoharie County. I had a couple of quibbles, a couple of errors in it, but it's still a good, look at the history. Most of this was written, decades ago, and then there's some modern, additions. But this would go into some real local history here. I do want to give a shout. Postcard show in Kingston, April 7th. For the Cattersville Postcard Club. I encourage folks to come. This show's strength is upstate New York cards. Some shows are good on topics or foreign or whatever. This show's strength is upstate cards. So I encourage folks to look and come look at the books, come talk, and as I said, you'll shut me down and you need to start your meeting.
Whenever you're done, you're doing a great job.
So just to give you a sense, like the John Hamm books, it's just phenomenal images. He has an incredible archive and access to other people with incredible archives. And I've actually worked with him on some images. I had one really not very good railroad shot. And when he worked on it, and he's a real whiz with the computer, which I'm not, he had it cleaned up and sharp. It looked like $1 million. So his books are so great on the images. Mike Kudish is on the literally mile by mile of walking the old tracks. The classic on the Ulster, Delaware is this from many years ago. And I wrote one thing that's kind of fun. The Ulster Delaware Railroad put out a guide for prospective passengers, basically a tourist guide, touting the hotels and the amenities and the attractions on their ride. So this would be 1906. And what's fun is that there's there'll be a listing of the hotels in each, from each station, and there are photographs. But just for example, I'm in Fleischmann's, and the thing I love seeing is that when you look at these guides, there are 60 hotels listed in my tiny community. Back then, that's how the railroads brought so many people up here.
Thank you.